All right, folks, grab a snack, preferably not medieval, unless you enjoy chewing on sadness. And let's dive into why eating in the Middle Ages was like signing up for a culinary torture chamber. Picture this, it's 1347. Your village smells like a mix of unwashed feet and despair, and your stomach's growling louder than a rabid wolf. You're dreaming of a juicy burger, but instead, you're handed a bowl of something that looks like it was scraped off a dungeon floor. Welcome to medieval cuisine, where flavor went to die, and your taste buds filed for bankruptcy. First off, let's set the scene. The Middle Ages, roughly 500 to 1500 AD, weren't exactly a golden era for gastronomy. Imagine a world where fine dining meant you didn't choke on a bone or contract dysentery. Most people were peasants, scraping by on whatever the land coughed up, which wasn't much. The soil was tired, the weather was moody, and the lord of the manor was too busy taxing your last potato to care if you starved. Food was less about enjoyment and more about not dying before sunset. Your average peasant diet was a monotonous parade of gruel, bread harder than a knight's helmet, and vegetables that tasted like regret. Meat, that was for nobles or the occasional pig you wrestled from the mud. And don't get me started on the hygiene. Spoons were a luxury, and washing your hands meant dunking them in the same river where everyone dumped their chamber pots. The kicker: food wasn't just scarce, it was often rancid. Preservation techniques were limited to salting, smoking, or praying the mold wouldn't kill you. Spoilage was so common that taste like death was probably a compliment. Imagine biting into a hunk of meat and realizing it's got more worms than flavor. Yum, and spices. Those were worth more than your house. So your stew tasted like boiled socks, unless you were royalty. Speaking of royalty, the rich didn't exactly live the gourmet dream either. Sure, they had access to exotic stuff like peacock or swan, but their chefs were basically medieval Gordon Ramsays without the talent, serving up overcooked game with a side of arrogance. Plus, their banquets were more about flexing wealth than actual taste. Think gold-plated pies filled with leave birds for the wow factor, not because anyone wanted to eat them. Meanwhile, the church had everyone by the holy short hairs dictating what you could eat. Lent meant no meat, no dairy, no fun for weeks, leaving you with fish so old it practically swam to your plate out of spite. And fasting days, you'd be nibbling on a crust of bread while dreaming of bacon, which, let's be honest, was probably rancid anyway. So, buckle up as we journey through this gastronomic nightmare. From moldy bread to mystery stews, we'll uncover why medieval food was the ultimate test of human endurance. Next up, we'll explore the peasant's daily grind. Literally, starting with the world's worst breakfast, porridge that could double as cement. Stay tuned, and maybe grab a modern sandwich to remind yourself life's not that bad. Rise and shine, medieval peasant. It's 5 a.m., the rooster's screaming like it's auditioning for a death metal band, and your breakfast is waiting to ruin your day. Meat porridge. The gloopy, gray sludge that's the cornerstone of your miserable diet. This isn't your fancy oatmeal with brown sugar and berries. No, this is a bowl of barely boiled grains. Think barley, oats, or whatever fell off the miller's cart, mixed with water and a pinch of "please don't let me die" vibes. It's so bland, you'd rather lick the floor for flavor, and so thick you could use it to patch your hut's walls. Cooking it, good luck. Your kitchen is a fire pit in a drafty shack. And your only pot's been used for everything from boiling turnips to dyeing your one shirt. The result: porridge that's half burnt, half raw, and tastes like a wet sock left in a barn. If you're lucky, you might score a dribble of milk from the cow, assuming she hasn't kicked over the bucket or caught some medieval cow plague. But don't get excited. Milk was often sore, and pasteurization was just a twinkle in nobody's eye. So you're slurping this lumpy disaster, trying not to think about the weevils doing backstrokes in it. Oh yeah, bugs were basically garnish back then. You didn't pick them out, you just chewed faster and pretended they were protein. Now, let's talk bread, the other star of your morning misery. This isn't a fluffy baguette from a Parisian bakery. Medieval bread was a dense, gritty brick that could knock out a horse, made from whatever grains you could scrape together: rye, barley, or the sweepings from the mill. It was often mixed with dirt, chaff, or actual rocks. The flour was coarse because milling tech was stuck in the Stone Age, and bakers weren't exactly Michelin-starred chefs. They'd knead the dough with unwashed hands, bake it in ovens fueled by whatever burned, and sell you a loaf that was half sawdust. Fun fact: some bakers stretched their flour with ground up acorns or beans, which sounds rustic until you realize it tasted like betrayal and gave you gas for days. Eating this bread was a workout. Your teeth, already on strike from a lifetime of gruel, had to chomp through crusts that felt like biting into a castle wall. And if the bread was a few days old, congrats. You're now gnawing on a rock, hard lump that could double as a weapon. Dunking it in your porridge was your only hope, but that just made it a soggy rock. The worst part: this was your fuel for a day of backbreaking labor, plowing fields, dodging the Lord's tax collector, or fending off rats the size of small dogs. No wonder peasants were cranky. Their breakfast was basically a war crime. So, as you choke down this morning misery, spare a thought for what's next for lunch, which, spoiler alert, isn't much better. We're about to dive into the world of pottage, the one pot wonder that makes porridge look gourmet. Grab your imaginary spoon and let's keep this tragic food tour rolling. Lunchtime in the Middle Ages, and you're dreaming of a sandwich, maybe a nice BLT with crispy bacon. Nope. Reality slaps you with pottage, the medieval equivalent of culinary Groundhog Day. This one, pot slop, was the backbone of peasant life, served at every meal like a cruel joke. Picture a cauldron bubbling over a smoky fire, filled with a murky mix of whatever you could scavenge. Wilted cabbage, a sad onion, some turnips that look like they've given up on life, and maybe a handful of oats. It's not a recipe, it's a cry for help. Pottage was the ultimate clean out the pantry dish, except your pantry was a damp corner of your hut with 3 moldy carrots and a leek you stole from the neighbor's pig. The base was usually water, because broth was for fancy folks, and you'd toss in anything edible: herbs, roots, or that questionable lump you found in the garden. Cooking it was an adventure. Your fire's either roaring like a dragon or fizzling out, so your pottage is either charred or raw. Stirring. That's with the stick you also use to chase rats. And don't expect consistency. This stuff ranged from watery gruel to a thick paste you could sculpt into a sad statue of your dreams
flavor, huh? If you were lucky.
You'd get a sprig of parsley or a bay leaf, but those were basically medieval unicorns. Most pottage tasted like boiled dirt with a hint of despair. Sometimes, you'd score a bone from last week's feast, if the dogs didn't get it first, and simmer it for stock. Problem is, that bone's been reused so many times it's basically flavorless calcium. And hygiene. Your cauldron's a bacterial rave, hosting germs from every meal since the Crusades. Eating pottage was a gamble. You'd scoop it into a wooden bowl, or just slurp it from the pot if you're feeling extrathetic, and pray it didn't give you the runs. Spoilage was a constant threat, so yesterday's pottage might come with a funky aftertaste and a side of food poisoning. If you were really desperate, you'd toss in some ale to mask the rot. Which, let's be honest, was the closest thing to a cocktail back then. The saddest part. This was your big meal of the day. You're out there plowing fields or dodging the plague. And your fuel is this lukewarm swamp water. No wonder knights were so grumpy. They were probably hangry 24/7. For variety, some folks added peas or lentils. But those were often so old, they crunched like gravel. And if you think pottage sounds bad for peasants, wait till you hear about the nobles. They jazz it up with a pinch of saffron or a chunk of venison, but it was still just fancy slop. So, as you gag on this medieval mush, brace yourself for what's next. The thrilling world of medieval vegetables, where every bite is a test of willpower. We'll dig into why your garden was more likely to kill you than feed you. Keep your imaginary fork handy. This ride's only getting grosser. Let's talk medieval veggies, because nothing says farm to table like a garden that's trying to murder you. You're a peasant hunched over your pathetic patch of dirt. Praying the crops don't flop like your last attempt at flirting with the miller's daughter. Your vegetable lineup is a sad crew: cabbage, turnips, leeks, and maybe some onions if the rats didn't throw a party first. These aren't the vibrant, Instagram-worthy veggies of today. They're gnarly, warm, riddled lumps that look like they've been through a war. Farming in the Middle Ages was a crapshoot. The soil was exhausted from centuries of overuse. And your tools were basically sticks and spite. No fertilizers, unless you count the manure you scooped from the pigsty, which doubled as your backyard. Weather was a jerk. Too wet. And your crops drowned. Too dry. And they shriveled like your hopes. Plus, the Lord took the best land for his deer park, leaving you with a rocky plot that grew more pebbles than plants. Cabbage was the MVP, but it wasn't the crisp stuff you shred for coleslaw. Medieval cabbage was tough, bitter, and so fibrous you'd need jaws of steel to chew it. Boiled into pottage, it turned into a slimy mess that tasted like a wet dog smells. Turnips were another staple, but they were woody, bland, and about as appetizing as gnawing on a table leg. Leeks and onions added some flavor, but they were often so small and sad you'd cry more from pity than their pungency. And storage. Good luck. Your root cellar was a damp hole where everything sprouted mold or got nibbled by critters. By spring, your veggies were either mush or sprouting tentacles. Eating them was like playing Russian roulette with botulism, fresh greens. Forget it. Spinach or lettuce was for monks with fancy gardens, not you. Wild herbs like nettles or dandelion might spice things up, but picking them meant dodging thorns, bugs, or the Lord's gamekeeper who'd flog you for poaching weeds. And don't think cooking made it better. Boiling was your only option, and overcooking turned everything into a flavorless paste. Roasting, that's for rich folks with actual ovens. Your fire pit just charred the outside while the inside stayed raw. The worst part, veggies were your lifeline, but they were often contaminated. Sewage was everywhere. Fields were fertilized with human waste, and rivers doubled as toilets. One bad bite, and you're praying to Saint Fiacre, patron saint of gardeners and hemorrhoids. For mercy, even nobles didn't escape the veggie curse. They get slightly better stuff, maybe some parsnips or artichokes. But it was still boiled to death and served with a side of smugness. Meanwhile, you're chomping on a turnip that's 90% dirt, wondering if starvation might be less painful. So, as you spit out a wormy cabbage leaf, get ready for the next horror show medieval meat, where fresh is a fantasy, and every bite comes with a side of regret. We'll explore why your protein dreams were more like a butcher's nightmare. Keep your gag reflex in check. This is about to get meaty. Meat in the Middle Ages sounds like a treat, right? Wrong. It was more like a high-stakes gamble where the prize was food poisoning and the consolation was a week of diarrhea. As a peasant, you're not grilling juicy steaks or savoring crispy bacon. Meat was a rare luxury, like finding a clean pair of socks in your hut. Most of your protein dreams were squashed by reality. Livestock was expensive, and your lord owned anything with a pulse. Your average meal was meatless, unless you count the occasional rat you accidentally boiled in your pottage. Let's break it down. Cows, pigs, and sheep were walking gold, raised for milk, wool, or plowing, not for your dinner plate. Slaughtering one was a last resort, like burning your only chair for firewood. If you did get meat, it was usually from an animal so old it had a retirement plan. Think stringy mutton from a sheep that died of natural causes, or pork from a pig that lost a fight with a cart. Chickens. Sure, if you could catch one before it outran you. But they were mostly for eggs, not drumsticks. Hunting was another pipe dream. The forests were the Lord's private zoo, and poaching a deer could cost you a hand or your life. Rabbits or birds might have been fair game, but good luck snaring them with your clumsy homemade traps. Fish was a slightly better bet, especially during Lent, when the church banned meat. But unless you lived near a river, your fish was salted cod, so old it smelled like a sailor's armpit. Fresh fish, that's for monks with their fancy fish ponds, not you. Wading in a polluted stream for eels. Preservation was the real kicker. No fridges, no freezers, just salt, smoke, or sheer denial. Salting turned meat into a leathery brick that tasted like a shipwreck. Smoking gave it a campfire vibe, but didn't hide the fact it was half rotten. And if you didn't preserve it right, hello, maggots. Eating meat meant chewing through gristle fat and the occasional mystery crunch you hoped wasn't a tooth. Hygiene was a myth. Butchers worked in open, air markets swarming with flies, and blood and guts spilled everywhere. Your meat was handled by hands that hadn't seen soap since the fall of Rome. Cooking didn't always save you. Roasting required a spit you didn't own, so you boiled everything in that same crusty cauldron, turning your precious pork into a soggy lump. Nobles had it slightly better. feasting on venison or wild boar, but even their meat was often overcooked or swimming in weird sauces to mask the rot. And don't forget the offal. Lungs, livers, and intestines were peasant staples because you couldn't afford to waste a scrap. Tripe stew, anyone. It's like eating a rubber hose. So, as you choke down a chewy bit of mystery meat, brace for the next chapter, medieval dairy, where milk, cheese, and butter were less, farm fresh, and more frightful. We'll dive into why your dairy dreams curdled faster than you can say. Cholera? Hold your nose. This one's gonna stink. Dairy in the Middle Ages sounds wholesome, like a pastoral fantasy of milking cows and churning butter. Spoiler, it was more like a bacterial horror show. As a peasant, you're not sipping frothy lattes or spreading creamy brie on a cracker. Dairy was a rare treat, and when you got it, it was often a rancid roulette wheel of regret. Let's milk this nightmare for all it's worth. First, the sorcier cow, if you were lucky enough to have one, was a bony, moody beast that gave more attitude than milk. Milking her was a daily wrestling match in a muddy barn, and hygiene. Forget it. Your hands were caked with dirt, the bucket was crusty, and flies were throwing a rave. The milk came out warm, unpasteurized, and ready to spoil faster than your dreams of a better life. Fresh milk was a race against time. Without refrigeration, it turned sour by noon, developing a tang that could wake the dead. Drinking it raw was like playing dairy Russian roulette. One gulp could be fine, the next could have you sprinting to the outhouse. Most peasants used milk sparingly, mixing it into porridge or pottage to stretch it. If you were fancy, you might make butter. But churning was a soul-crushing arm workout that left you with a tiny lump of grazy sadness. Butter was rarely fresh, it went rancid quick, tasting like a mix of gym, socks, and regret. Salting helped, but that just made it a salty gym sock. Cheese was the big dairy flex, but don't picture a nice cheddar. Medieval cheese was often soft, crumbly, and made in conditions that would make a health inspector weep. You'd curdle milk with whatever rennet you could scrape from a calf's stomach, then press it in a moldy cloth and hope for the best. The result, a funky, sweaty wheel that ranged from cuttable to "is this alive?" Hard cheeses lasted longer, but they were so tough you needed a chisel to eat them. Storage was a joke. Your cheese sat in a damp hut, attracting mold and mice like it was hosting a pest convention. And hygiene. The same hands milking the cow were kneading the cheese, fresh from shoveling manure. No wonder dysentery was the medieval MVP. During Lent, when meat was off the menu, dairy was a lifeline. If it didn't kill you first. But even that was limited, since the church sometimes banned it too, leaving you with nothing but prayers and a rumbling gut. Nobles had better dairy, with access to cream and fancier cheeses, but even their stuff was often spoiled or oversalted to hide the funk. The worst part, dairy was a status symbol. If you had a cow, you were basically medieval middle class. But one bad season or a sick animal, and you're back to eating dirt-flavored pottage. So, as you spit out a curdled chunk of mystery cheese, get ready for the next disaster: medieval drinks, where water was a death trap and Al was your only friend. We'll dive into why staying hydrated was a full-time survival game. Grab a mug. This one's gonna be a wild ride. Thirsty in the Middle Ages. Good luck staying hydrated without signing up for a one-way trip to the graveyard. Water was the medieval equivalent of a biohazard. Rivers were basically open sewers. Lakes were petri dishes. And wells were often contaminated with everything from cow dung to your neighbor's unmentionables. Drinking it straight was like asking for a V-pass to the Coalera party. So, what did you chug to stay alive? Let's pour into the world of medieval beverages, where every sip was a gamble. The peasants go to us all. And no, this wasn't your craft IPA with notes of citrus and regret. Medieval all was a murky, low alcohol sludge brewed from barley, oats, or whatever grains you hadn't fed to the pigs. It was safer than water because the brewing process killed some germs, but safe is relative when your brewmaster's washing his socks in the same vat. All was weak, about 2% alcohol. So you could guzzle it all day without getting hammered. Just slightly buzzed and bloated. It tasted like sore bread soup with chunks of yeast and the occasional twig for texture. Women often did the brewing, which was less girl boss and more, we're all gonna die if I don't. Every household made their own. So quality varied from drinkable to did I just swallow a shoe? Storage was a mess. Ale spoiled fast, so you drank it quick or ended up with a mug of vinegar. For special occasions, you might get made from fermented honey, but that was rare unless you had bees or a side hustle robbing hives. Mead was sweeter, but still gritty, like drinking a beehive's bad day. Wine was for the rich, and even then, it wasn't the fancy Bordeaux of today. Medieval wine was often sour, diluted with water, yep, the same nasty water. Or spiked with herbs to mask the fact it tasted like regret. Peasants might snag some cheap vino during festivals, but it was usually so bad you'd rather lick a barrel. Cider was another option if you had apples, but it was more like fermented apple sweat than a crisp, hard cider. And milk. We already covered that curdled catastrophe. The church loomed large over your drinking habits, too. Fasting days meant no all in some strict monasteries, leaving you with nothing but prayers to quench your thirst. Meanwhile, nobles were swigging imported wine and boasting about it, while you're stuck with ale that smells like a wet dog. The worst part, no caffeine. Coffee and tea hadn't hit Europe yet. So your morning pick, me, up was a slap from the cold or the rooster's screech. Drinking was a social affair, though. Taverns were the medieval equivalent of a dive bar, where you'd swap stories, dodge bar fights, and try not to puke from the ale's aftertaste. Hygiene was, as usual, a myth. Cups were shared, and nobody cared if the last guy had the plague. So, as you chug your gritty ale, brace for the next culinary crime scene, medieval spices, or lac thereof, where flavor was a rich man's game. We'll explore why your food was as bland as your life. Keep sipping. This tale's about to get spicy, or not. Let's talk flavor in the Middle Ages, or rather, the tragic lack of it. If you're a peasant, your food is so bland it put a coma patient to sleep. Spices, the medieval equivalent of a private jet. Only the rich could afford them, and you were stuck dreaming of a pinch of anything to make your pottage less pathetic. Welcome to the spice trade, where flavor was a flex, and your taste buds were in permanent hibernation. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, or saffron were worth more than your entire village. They came from far-off lands, India, Indonesia, the Middle East, hauled across deserts and oceans by traders who risked pirates, bandits, and dysentery for a sack of cloves. By the time they hit Europe, a single peppercorn could buy you a cow or a knight with a questionable tavern wench. Nobles sprinkled this stuff like medieval bling, not because it tasted good, but to show they could afford it. You, meanwhile, are seasoning your stew with dirt and prayers. Local herbs were your only shot at flavor, but they were hit or miss. Parsley, sage, or thyme grew in your garden if you could keep the goats from eating them. But they were mild and often wilted into nothingness when boiled. Wild herbs, like mustard or nettles, added some kick. But foraging meant dodging wolves or the Lord's goons, who'd accuse you of trespassing. Salt was the peasant's spice MVP, but even that was a hassle. It was taxed, hoarded, and sometimes so gritty you'd crunch on sand mid-bite. Plus, salting your food was more about preservation than taste. So your stew was less savory and more, "I hope this doesn't kill me." The church didn't help, preaching that fancy flavors were sinful, as if your life wasn't miserable enough. For the rich, spices were a circus. They'd dump saffron, worth more than gold, into their sauces, not for flavor but to make their guests gag with envy. Medieval chefs went wild, mixing sweet, sour, and spicy into bizarre combos like cinnamon slathered pork or ginger crusted fish. It wasn't about taste, it was about flexing. Ever try mustard? The rich loved it, grinding it into a fiery paste that'd clear your sinuses and your soul. Peasants might snag a dab during a festival, but it was like borrowing a Ferrari for a day. Back to Blancheville tomorrow. The worst part: spices often hid rot. If your meat was turning green, a blast of pepper could mask the stench. But not the fact you're eating a biohazard. And adulteration was rampant. Merchants cut spices with sawdust or worse, so even the rich got scammed. Your flavor options were so limited that seasoning often meant tossing in whatever was lying around, like El dregs or a questionable mushroom you hoped wasn't poisonous. No wonder medieval breath was legendary. You're eating unseasoned slop with a side of despair. So, as you choke on your flavorless gruel, get ready for the next disaster. Medieval cooking methods, where chef meant guy with a stick and a fire. We'll dive into why your kitchen was a death trap. Keep your imaginary apron on. This is gonna burn. Cooking in the Middle Ages was less. Bon appetit and more. Please don't let this kill me. Your kitchen was a smoky, hazardous shack. And your culinary skills were limited to praying the fire didn't burn down your hut. Let's fire up the medieval stove and explore why preparing food was a daily dance with disaster. As a peasant, your cooking setup was a pit of despair. Literally, a central hearth, maybe a clay oven if you were fancy, was your only heat source. The fire was fueled by wood, straw, or dried dung, which filled your home with smoke thicker than a dragon's fart. Ventilation. Huh? Your roof had a hole, but that just let in rain and the occasional pigeon. Coughing was just part of the cooking process, along with dodging sparks that could ignite your straw bed. Your tools were a joka, a crusty cauldron, a wooden spoon, and maybe a knife so dull it couldn't cut butter. Boiling was your go-to method because it was simple. Toss everything in the pot and hope it didn't explode. But controlling the heat was like herding cats. Too hot, and your pottage turned to charcoal. Too cold, and it's raw sludge. Roasting was for the rich with their fancy spits and servants to turn them. You might try skewering a rat over the fire, but good luck getting it cooked without burning your fingers off. Baking was a rare treat. Most peasants didn't have ovens, so you trekked to the village baker, who charged you half your grain to use his. The result: a loaf so dense it could double as a doorstop. Hygiene was, predictably, a nightmare. Your cauldron was never cleaned, just scraped out, hosting a microbial rave from last month's stew. Water for cooking came from the same river, where everyone bathed, dumped waste, and watered their cows. Flies buzzed around like they owned the place, and your hands were dirtier than a pigsty. No wonder stomachache was medieval for "I'm probably dying" recipes. Forget it. Cooking was trial and error, mostly error. You learned from your mom, who learned from her mom, who probably poisoned half the family by accident. Measurements were a handful or until it looks edible, which it never did. Nobles had it better, with actual kitchens and cooks who could read. But their food was still a mess. Overcooked game drowned in weird sauces to hide the rot. They loved showy dishes, like pies with live birds that flew out when cut, because nothing says fancy like feathers in your soup. The worst part: fire hazards. One stray spark, and your hut's a bonfire. Cooking accidents were so common that, burnt to a crisp, probably started as a medieval chef's epitaph. And don't forget the time sink. Prepping a meal took hours of chopping, grinding, and cursing, leaving you too exhausted to enjoy the slop you made. So, as you fan the smoke from your eyes, brace for the next horror: medieval feasts, where excess met indigestion. We'll dive into why even the rich suffered through their banquets. Grab a fire extinguisher. This tale's heating up. Medieval feasts sound like a blast. Tables groaning with food, wine flowing, and jesters juggling flaming torches. But hold your horses, because even the rich were choking down a buffet of regret at these shindigs. Let's crash a noble's banquet and see why they're lavish. Spreads were more about flexing than flavor. Picture a grand hall, tapestries on the walls, and a lord showing off like he's the medieval Elon Musk. The tables piled high with dishes. But don't get too excited. Half of it's inedible, and the other half's a health hazard. First up, the centerpiece, a whole roasted animal, like a boar or a swan, stuffed with smaller animals because apparently medieval chefs were into culinary Russian dolls. The swan's been re-feathered to look alive, which is cute until you realize it's been sitting out for hours, collecting flies like a feathered Petri dish. You slice into it, and the meat's tougher than a knight's ego, overcooked to a crisp or still bloody, because medieval ovens were as reliable as a drunk squire. Sauces were the saving grace, or so they thought. Nobles drowned their food in gloopy mixes of wine, vinegar, and spices like cinnamon or cloves, not for taste, but to mask the fact the meat was halfway to Narnia. These sauces were so thick you could stand a spoon in them, and the flavor was like licking a spice merchant's armpit. Overwhelming and weird. Side dishes. Think soggy veggies boiled into oblivion, or pies filled with mystery mints that could be anything from pigeon to. Don't ask. Bread was a status symbol, with the rich getting fluffy white loaves while you're gnawing on your usual gravelly brick. But even their bread got stale fast, so they'd soak it in sauce or use it as a plate. Yep, trenchers. were just slabs of bread that soaked up grease and got fed to the dogs or peasants afterward. Drinks flowed, but wine was often sore, and all was the same gritty swill you drank at home. The real show was the spectacle. Cooks loved serving subtleties, like sugar sculptures or pies that burst open with live animals. Imagine cutting into a dessert and a flock of sparrows craps on your plate. Classy. Hygiene was a joke. Everyone shared cups, and hands were wiped on tablecloths or the nearest dog. The floor was a landfill of bones, spilled sauce, and drunk guests. And pacing, non-existent. You'd stuff yourself through 20 courses, from peacock to pudding, until your stomach begged for mercy. The aftermath. Indigestion so bad you'd pray for the Black Death instead. Even the rich suffered. Gout was basically a noble's loyalty card from too much meat and wine. For peasants, feasts were a rare invite, usually at harvest or Christmas, where you'd get scraps and feel grateful for a chicken wing that wasn't entirely bone. So, as you dodge a flying pigeon from the pie, get ready for the next mess, medieval street food, where markets served up snacks as dodgy as a used cart salesman. We'll explore why grabbing a quick bite was a one-way ticket to regret. Keep your wallet close. This is gonna be a wild market ride. Strolling through a medieval market sounds charming. Bustling stalls, the smell of fresh bread, maybe a cheeky pie to munch on. Wrong. Medieval street food was a gauntlet of grace, grime, and gastrointestinal regret. Let's dive into the chaotic world of market munchies, where every bite was a roll of the dysentery dice. Picture a muddy town square, packed with shouting vendors, stray dogs, and pickpockets who'd steal your last turnip. The air's thick with smoke, sweat, and the stench of something that might be food or might be a dead rat. Your stomach's growling, and you've got a few pennies for a snack. What's on the menu? First up, pies. Medieval fast food at its finest, or worst. These handheld pastries were stuffed with whatever the vendor could scrounge as stringy mutton, questionable fish, or a mush of veggies and mystery meat. The crust was so tough you'd need a blacksmith's jaw to chew it, and the filling was often a day away from turning toxic. Vendors weren't exactly Gordon Ramsay. Hygiene was optional, and they'd need dough with hands fresh from gutting fish. One bite, and you're praying the gravy isn't just rancid fat. Hot tip, if the pay's suspiciously cheap. It's probably because the meat's been recycled from last week's feast. Next, there's roasted bits. Think skewers of meat or fish cooked over an open fire. Sounds tasty. But the meat was usually the dregs, fatty pork scraps, old pigeon, or eels from a river that doubled as a sewer. The vendor's flipping these skewers with a stick he also uses to scratch his unmentionables, and the fire spitting ash and fleas into your lunch. Want a side? Grab some boiled eggs. Sold by a guy whose basket looks like it's been through a war. They're often half spoiled with a sulfurous whiff that could knock out a horse. Bread rolls were another staple, but these weren't fluffy buns. They're dense, gritty, and sometimes baked with chalk or sawdust to stretch the flour. Slather on some rancid butter, and you've got a snack that's half food, half punishment. Drinks. Ale from a cart, served in a communal cup that's been kissed by every drunk in town. It's warm, flat, and tastes like it was brewed in a boot. The worst part, no health inspectors. Vendors could sell whatever, and if you got sick, tough luck. blame a witch or bad stars. Markets were also a scam central. Weights were rigged, prices jacked up. And that, fresh. Fish might have been dead longer than your dreams of knighthood. For the rich, markets were a no-go. They sent servants to haggle, while they dined on slightly less awful stuff at home. Peasants, though, you're dodging mud flies, and shady dealers for a pie that's more regret than reward. So, as you spit out a fishbone from your sketchy skewer, brace for the next horror medieval sweets, where sugar was rare, and desserts were a tooth-breaking nightmare. We'll dive into why satisfying your sweet tooth was a one-way ticket to pain. Keep your dentist on speed dial. This is gonna hurt. Got a sweet tooth in the Middle Ages. Tough luck, because desserts were less yummy. And more. Why is my mouth bleeding? Sugar was rarer than a unicorn. And medieval sweets were a gritty, tooth-shattering ordeal. Let's sink our teeth, or what's left of them, into the world of medieval confectionery, where every treat was a test of endurance. As a peasant, sweets were a once-in-a-blue moon fantasy. Sugar came from cane, grown far away in places you'd never heard of, and cost more than your hut, cow, and kids combined. Honey was your best bet, but unless you were a beekeeper or brave enough to fistfight a swarm, it was scarce. Most of your desserts were just fruit. Think Millie apples or pears so hard they could double as catapult ammo. Fresh fruit was seasonal, and storage turned it into mush or mold faster than you could say scurvy. Dried fruit, like raisins or figs, was a treat, but only if you could afford imports or dodge the worms that hitched a ride. For special occasions, you might get a baked good, like a cake or pastry. But these were no fluffy cupcakes. Medieval cakes were dense, spiced lumps of flour, honey, and whatever nuts or fruit you could scrounge. They were so hard you'd chip a tooth. And the spices, ginger or cloves, were more about showing off than tasting good. Pastries were similar, with crusts like leather and fillings that ranged from, okay, does this just boiled cabbage? Baking was a hassle, so you'd save these for festivals, where you'd choke them down and pretend to be grateful. The rich had fancier sweets, but they were still weird. They'd splurge on marzipan, molded into shapes like castles or saints. Which sounds cool until you realize it was gritty and tasted like almond-flavored glue. Sugared fruits or candied peels were another noble flex. But they were so expensive you'd sell your soul for a bite. And don't forget subtleties. Sugar sculptures that were more art than food, meant to wow guests, not feed them. Imagine a sugar dragon that cost more than your village, but crumbles into sticky dust when you try to eat it. The worst part, dental care was a myth. Your teeth were already crumbling from gritty bread and sour ale, so chomping on rock, hard sweets was like signing up for a medieval root canal. And hygiene. Bakers handled dough with hands fresh from cleaning the pigsty, so your treat might come with a side of plague. Kids loved sweets, but giving them a sticky bun was like handing them a germ bomb. Even the church got involved, frowning on gluttony, but happily munching consecrated wafers that were the closest thing to a cookie you'd ever taste. For peasants, the sweetest thing was dreaming of a better life while gnawing on a stale crust. So, as you spit out a chunk of petrified pear, get ready for the next disaster: medieval food storage, where keeping your grub edible was a full-time war against rotten rats we'll dive into why your pantry was a nightmare. Keep your trap shut. This one's crawling with pests. Storing food in the Middle Ages was like playing a losing game of keep, away with rot, rats, and ruin. Your pantry wasn't a neat cupboard with Tupperware. It was a damp corner of your hut. A root cellar if you were lucky, or just a sack you prayed the mice wouldn't find. Let's dig into the medieval storage struggle, where every harvest was a race against decay. As a peasant, your food had to last through winter because Mother Nature didn't deliver DoorDash when the snow hit. Grain was your lifeline, barley, wheat, or rye. But storing it was a nightmare. You'd pile it in a granary or a sack, but dampness turned it moldy, and bugs moved in like they owned the place. Weevils were so common you'd just grind them into your flour and call it extra crunch. Rats and mice were bolder than a drunken knight, gnawing through sacks and leaving their droppings like a calling card. Root veggies, like turnips or carrots, went into a cellar, a dark, soggy hole that was half storage, half swamp. If the temperature swung, your crops sprouted or rotted into a slimy mess. Cabbage might last a bit, but by spring, it was either mush or growing a new ecosystem. Fruit, forget it. Apples and pears turned to sludge unless you dried them, which was a tedious chore that didn't always work. Meat was the real challenge. Slaughtering a pig was a fall ritual, but preserving it was a crapshoot. Salting was your best bet, but salt was pricey, and if you skimped, your pork turned into a maggot motel. Smoking over a fire helped, but it didn't stop spoilage, just slowed it down. By February, your bacon was green furry and smelled like a corpse's armpit. Fish was even worse. Salted cod or herring was so pungent it could wake a coma patient, and one bad batch meant a week of puking. Dairy was a ticking time bomb. Milk spoiled in hours. Cheese molded fast, and butter went rancid unless you buried it in a bog, which some folks actually did. Even then, digging up your bog butter was like unearthing a prehistoric stink bomb. The rich had better storage. Stone cellars, barrels, and servants to guard the goods, but even they lost half their stock to rot or thieves. Hygiene, non-existent. Your storage space doubled as a home for spiders, rodents, and the occasional stray cat. Containers were wooden or clay, rarely sealed tight, and cleaning them was a fantasy. The church didn't help, demanding tithes of your grain while you're fighting off vermin with a broom. Theft was another issue. Neighbors, bandits, or even your own kids might swipe your last onion. By late winter, you're eating the dregs, moldy bread, slimy veggies, and meat you're pretty sure is plotting revenge. Starvation was a real threat, and spring hunger was when you prayed for weeds to sprout. So, as you shoo a rat off your last turnip, brace for the next mess, medieval food myths, where superstition made eating even weirder. We'll debunk why your stew came with a side of folklore. Keep your lucky charm handy. This is going to get strange. Medieval folks didn't just eat to survive. They spiced their meals with a hefty dose of superstition and batshit crazy beliefs. Welcome to the world of medieval food myths, where your stew came with a side of folklore, and every bite was a cosmic gamble. Let's unravel the weird rituals and wacky ideas that made eating an adventure in absurdity. First off, food was never just food. It was a divine message. The church had everyone convinced that what you ate could save your soul or damn it. Garlic. Some said it warded off demons. Others thought it attracted witches. Either way, your breath was a weapon of mass destruction. Bread was sacred. Dropping a crumb was like spitting on Jesus. And some swore a loaf baked on Good Friday could cure disease. Spoiler, it didn't. But it probably gave you indigestion. Certain foods were tied to sin. Apples were suspect because of that whole Eden fiasco, so chomping one might make the priest's side eye you. Meat was caught, and lusty, so monks avoided it to keep their holy bits in check. While veggies were cold and humble, perfect for fasting. Meanwhile, you're eating turnips not because they're pious buys, but because it's all you've got. Humoral theory was the medieval equivalent of a TikTok diet trend. Your body had 4 humors: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And food was supposed to balance them. Too much pork. You're overheating and ready to rage. Too many leaks. You're a phlegmy mess. Doctors, who were basically glorified barbers, prescribed bizarre diets, like eating peacock to cure melancholy. Good luck affording that on your peasant budget. Superstitions ran wild. Spilling salt was bad luck, probably because it cost more than your cow. Some believed stirring pottage counterclockwise invited the devil, so you're clockwise, spinning like a paranoid DJ, planting crops under a full moon was thought to boost yields. But your turnips still sucked because the soil was garbage. And don't get started on aphrodisiacs. Oysters, eggs, or anything vaguely phallic was supposed to get you frisky, which is hilarious when your diet's so bad you're too tired to blink. Witches were blamed for everything: milk, spoiled, witch curse. Bread didn't rise. Witch hex. You'd toss a clove or a prayer into your pot to ward off evil, but it didn't stop the weevils from throwing a rave in your flour. The rich were just as nutty, serving dishes shaped like saints or sprinkling gold dust on their food for health. Spoiler, eating metal didn't make you immortal, but it did make you broke. Even animals weren't safe from myth. A hare crossing your path meant your stew was doomed, and some swore a rooster's crow could spoil your owl. No wonder you're eating in constant fear of cosmic payback. These beliefs made every meal a ritual, turning your sad pottage into a spiritual minefield. So, as you whisper a prayer over your moldy bread, get ready for the next chapter: medieval food crimes where cheating bakers and dodgy butchers made your life even worse. We'll dive into why trusting a vendor was a one-way ticket to regret. Keep your pitchfork ready. This is gonna get shady. If you thought medieval food was bad, wait till you meet the crooks who sold it. Welcome to the world of medieval food crimes, where bakers, butchers, and vendors were shadier than a cut-rate alchemist. Markets were a den of scams, and every purchase was a leap of faith or stupidity. Let's dive into why trusting a medieval food seller was like asking a fox to guard your chickens. Bakers were the rock stars of rip-offs. Bread was life. But these guys stretched their dough with everything but honesty. They'd mix in sawdust, chalk, or ground up beans to bulk up the flour, turning your loaf into a gritty gut punch. Some kneaded dough with their feet. Yes, feet. Because who needs hygiene when you've got profit? Underweight loaves were a classic trick. They'd sell you a pound of bread that was half air, half lies. If you caught them, they'd face the pillory, where folks pelted them with rotten veggies. Karma's a baker, baby. Butchers were no better. Meat was gold, so they'd pad their cuts with fat, gristle, or bits of animals you'd rather not name. Selling spoiled meat was an art form. Slap on some pepper or dunk it in vinegar, and that rancid mutton's fresh again. Dog or cat meat might end up labeled as lamb, and you'd be none the wiser until your stew tasted like regret. Their stalls were fly-infested bloodbaths, and the cleaning was just kicking the guts into the street. Ale cellars were the sneakiest. They'd water down their brew or reuse old barrels, serving you a pint that was half river muck. Some added herbs to mask the rot, so your ale tasted like a potion gone wrong, and weights rigged. You'd pay for a gallon and get a thimble. The church tried to crack down, preaching honest measures, but vendors just bribed the inspectors with a free pie, probably stuffed with sawdust. Markets were chaos. No health codes, no refunds. Just a shouting match between you and a guy selling fresh fish that's been dead since the last crusade. Adulteration was everywhere. Milk cut with chalk. Wine spiked with lead to sweeten it. Even spices mixed with dirt. Lead poisoning. Just another Tuesday. The rich weren't immune. Their fancy imports were often fake. Like saffron. That was just dyed straw. Guilds were supposed to regulate this mess, but they were more like medieval mafias, protecting their own, while you choked on their scams. Punishments were harsh but spotty. A cheating baker might get his oven smashed, or a butcher could be fined for selling rotten pork. But enforcement was a joke. Corruption was as common as fleas. As a peasant, you had to haggle like a pro or get fleeced. If you complained, good luck. The vendor's mates would back him up, and you'd slink home with a loaf of lies. So, as you spit out a chunk of chalky bread, brace for the next horror, medieval food for kids, where even the little ones suffered. We'll explore why growing up meant surviving the worst grub imaginable. Keep your bib on. This is going to be messy. Kids in the Middle Ages didn't get Happy Meals or fruit snacks. They got the same miserable grub as adults, only smaller and sadder. Feeding a medieval child was like trying to keep a tiny, screaming peasant alive on a diet of despair and dysentery. Let's dive into the grim world of kiddie cuisine, where every bite was a lesson in survival. As a peasant parent, your food options were already a nightmare: pottage, bread, and maybe a wooded turnip if the rats didn't get it first. Kids ate the same slop, just mushed up for toothless tots or cut into smaller chunks for the bigger ones. Babies started on breast milk, but if mom was malnourished, which was basically always, it was thin and barely enough. Wet nurses were a thing, but only for nobles or if you could barter your last onion for one. By 6 months, you're weaning your kid onto porridge, a gluey mix of oats and water that looked like it was scraped off a stable floor. It was bland, lumpy, and often crawling with weevils. But you'd spoon it into their tiny mouths and hope they didn't choke. Older kids got bread, but the same gritty rock, hard loaves you're gnawing on. Cutting it into bite-sized pieces was a workout, and their little teeth took a beating. Pottage was the main event, a watery stew of cabbage, leeks, and whatever else you could scavenge. If you were lucky, you'd toss in a bit of bacon fat for flavor, but that was rarer than a sunny day. Kids hated it, who wouldn't? But hunger was a great motivator, and they'd slurp it down or starve. Meat was a pipe dream. Maybe at Christmas you'd get a scrap of pork, but otherwise your kid's protein came from beans or the occasional egg. Assuming the hen wasn't on strike. Dairy was a gamble. Milk spoiled fast, and cheese was often moldy. Giving your kid a chunk of funky curd was like playing tummy roulette. Fruit and veggies were seasonal, so your kid might munch on an apple in fall. But by winter, it's just turnips again. Hygiene was a horror show. You're feeding them with unwashed hands from a bowl that's been cleaned in a germy river. Spoons were shared, and nobody cared if the last user had a cough. Kids dropped food on floors covered in dirt, straw, and worse, then popped it back in their mouths. No wonder half didn't make it to age 5. Diarrhea was basically a childhood milestone. The church didn't help, enforcing fasting days, even for kids, so your little one's nibbling crusts while dreaming of a chicken leg. Nobles had it slightly better, with softer bread and occasional sweets like honeyed fruit, but their kids still faced spoiled milk and overcooked meat. For peasant kids, the treat was a rare festival where they might snag a stale pastry or a sip of wateriol. Growing up meant learning to stomach the same garbage diet as mom and dad, with zero complaints. So, as you wipe pottage off your kid's chin, get ready for the next mess: medieval food during famine, where hunger turned grim into gruesome. We'll explore why starvation was a way of life. Keep your belt tight. This is gonna hurt. Famine in the Middle Ages wasn't just a bad day. It was a soul-crushing, stomach-gnawing apocalypse that turned your already awful diet into a fight for survival. When crops failed, which was depressingly often, you weren't just hungry, you were eating things that make a vulture gag. Let's plunge into the grim world of medieval famine food, where desperation was the main ingredient. Picture 1315, the Great Famine's kicking off, and rains turned your fields into a muddy swamp. Wheat, barley, and oats are rotting before they ripen, and your lord's still demanding his tithe like a tax-happy troll. Your usual pottage is now a memory. You're lucky if you've got a handful of moldy grain to boil. Starvation's knocking, and your pantry's emptier than a minstrel's wallet. First resort, stretch what little you've got. You'd grind anything vaguely edible. Acorns, chestnut hulls, even tree bark, into a gritty flour for bread that tasted like sawdust and sorrow. Roots and weeds, like nettles or dandelions, became your new veggies. But they were bitter and barely filled the void. If you had a cow, you'd bleed her for a nutrient hit, mixing the blood with scraps for a grim stew. Slaughtering her was a last-ditch move. She was your milk machine, and eating her meant no dairy tomorrow. When stores ran dry, things got weird. You'd scavenge for snails, frogs, or hedgehogs, roasting them over a fire that's burning your last chair. Rats, once your pantry pests, were now dinner, assuming you could catch one before it outsmarted you. Some turned to famine foods, like grass or clay, which filled your belly but wrecked your guts. Stories from Chronicles. Yeah, this is real. Talk of people eating dirt or their own shoes. Though leather probably tasted better than your usual bread. Cannibalism wasn't common, but it happened. In dire famines, whispers of eating the dead, or even kids, cropped up, though most stuck to less horrific horrors. The church frowned on it, but was too busy hoarding their grain to help. Speaking of, monasteries and nobles often had secret stashes. While you're out here chewing twigs, towns were hit hard, markets shut down, and bakers stopped baking. Urban poor ate garbage, literally scavenging dung heaps for scraps. Rural peasants weren't much better, fighting over the last turnip while dodging bandits who'd kill for a crust. Kids and the elderly dropped first, too weak to handle the hunger. Disease loved famine. Malnutrition made you a magnet for plague or dysentery, so if starvation didn't get you, a fever might. The rich suffered less, with their private granaries and imported goods, but even they tightened their belts when trade routes faltered. For you, famine meant hard choices. Eat the seed grain and doom next year's crop, or starve now. Either way, you're screwed. By the time spring rolled around, you're a skeleton praying for a harvest that might not come. So, as you choke down a soup of boiled grass, brace for the next nightmare, medieval food and religion, where the church turned eating into a spiritual obstacle course. We'll explore why your diet was a holy minefield. Keep your rosary close. This is gonna get preachy. In the Middle Ages, eating wasn't just about filling your belly. It was a spiritual tightrope walk, thanks to the church's iron grip on your fork. Every bite came with a side of divine judgment, and one wrong move could land you in a confessional or worse. Let's dive into the holy mess of medieval food and religion. Where your diet was a ticket to heaven or a one-way trip to hellfire. The church was the ultimate food critic, dictating what, when, and how you ate. Fasting was their favorite hobby. Hundreds of days a year were clean, meaning no meat, no dairy, no fun. Lent was the big one. 40 days of misery where you're stuck with fish so old it smelled like Satan's socks. Fish was holy, apparently, but nobody told the cod, which arrived salted, stinky, and tough as leather. If you couldn't afford fish, you're nibbling bread and weeds, praying for a miracle to make it taste better. Feast days were the flip side, where you could gorge. Within reason. Christmas or Easter meant a rare chance at pork or a pie. But overeating was gluttony, a sin that have you doing penance faster than you could burp. The church loved its rulers. No meat on Fridays to honor Jesus' crucifixion. No food before Mass, and don't even think about sneaking a snack during a fast. Monks took it to extremes, living on bread and water to purify their souls. While you're just trying to purify your pottage of weevils, food was symbolic, too. Bread wasn't just lunch. It was Christ's body in the Eucharist, so wasting a crumb was like drop, kicking a saint. Wine was his blood, but good luck getting a sip unless you're a priest. Certain foods had baggage. Pork was unclean, to some theologians tied to Jewish laws, while others said it was fine. Nobody agreed, so you ate it and hoped God wasn't taking notes. The rich used religion to flex, serving lavish feasts on feast days to show piety and wealth. Think swan roasted in its feathers, or a pie stuffed with scripture, quoting monks. Okay, maybe not that, but you get the vibe. Meanwhile, you're fasting with a crust of bread, wondering if God hates you. This screwed you over too. The church demanded 1/10 of your grain, livestock, even your sad little onions, leaving you hungrier while they stockpiled the good stuff. Monasteries had fish ponds and vineyards, feasting like kings while preaching poverty. Hypocrisy, thy name is medieval clergy. Superstition bled into faith. Some believed eating hair made you lustful, or that garlic kept demons at bay. witches were blamed for spoiled milk. So you'd pray over your churn like it was a holy relic. Even recipes had a spiritual spin. Stir your pottage with a cross to keep the devil out. Breaking the rules. Risk excommunication or a public shaming, like wearing a sign saying, I ate bacon on Friday. So, as you whisper a prayer over your fishy sludge, brace for the next disaster. Medieval food and health, where every meal was a medical minefield. We'll explore why your diet was a doctor's nightmare. Keep your leeches handy. This is gonna bleed. Your medieval diet wasn't just gross. It was a one-way ticket to the infirmary, assuming you could find a doctor who wasn't busy bleeding you dry. Welcome to the grim intersection of medieval food and health, where every meal was a medical disaster waiting to happen. Let's slice into why your grub was as deadly as a justing lance. First, nutrition was a foreign concept. Your diet of bread, pottage, and the occasional turnip was a carbohydrate bomb with barely any protein, vitamins, or minerals. Scurvy was a regular guest, thanks to a lack of fresh fruit. Your gums bled, your teeth fell out, and you looked like a pirate's nightmare. Rickets hit kids hard, bending bones because dairy was scarce, and sunlight was a luxury when you're slaving in the fields. Malnutrition was your shadow, leaving you weak, tired, and ready to keel over from a stiff breeze. Food safety. Hospolage was a way of life. Meat went rancid, milk curdled, and grain molded faster than you could say. Botulism. Preservation, like salting or smoking, helped, but it didn't stop the creepy crawlies. Maggots in your pork were just extra protein, right? Water was a germ soup, and even ale wasn't always safe if the brewer's vat was a bacterial playground. Dysentery was so common, it was practically a personality trait. And food poisoning was just Tuesday's lunch special. Hygiene was a myth. You're cooking in a cauldron that's never been cleaned, eating with hands fresh from the pigsty, and sharing bowls with your plaguey neighbor. Fields were fertilized with human waste, so your cabbage came pre-seasoned with cholera. Markets were no better. Vendors handled meat with hands that make a sewer rat gag. No wonder half the population didn't make it past 40. Medieval medicine didn't help. Doctors leaned on humoral theory, blaming your sickness on unbalanced humors. Got a fever? Eat cold foods like lettuce. Feeling sluggish? Try spicy peacock. These quacks prescribed diets that were as useful as a screen door on a submarine, and their cures often made you worse. The rich weren't immune. Gout was their reward for too much meat and wine, leaving them hobbling like grumpy walruses. Dental health was a horror show. Gritty bread and sticky sweets, if you ever got them, ground your teeth to nubs. Tooth decay was universal, and the dentist was a blacksmith with pliers and a bad attitude. Abscesses, infections, and breath that could kill a dragon were standard. The church added insult to injury, saying illness was God's punishment. So you're praying over your pottage instead of washing your hands. Famine made it worse, stripping what little nutrition you had and inviting diseases like plague to the party. Even when food was plentiful, it was unbalanced. Too much starch, not enough greens, and protein was a fever dream for most peasants. Nobles overindulged, packing on pounds and heart trouble, while you're starving on a diet of hope and weeds. So, as you spit out a tooth from your gritty bread, brace for the next mess: medieval food and class. where what you ate screamed your social status. We'll dive into why your plate was a billboard of poverty. Keep your fork. This is gonna sting. In the Middle Ages, your plate was a screaming neon sign of your social status. Noble or peasant, rich or dirt poor, everyone knew your place by what you shoveled into your face. Let's carve into the class divide of medieval food, where the haves ate swan and the have-nots ate sadness. As a peasant, your diet was a monotonous slog of pottage, gritty bread, and whatever weeds you could scavenge. Your food was brown, bland, and barely enough to keep you from collapsing in the fields. Meat was a rare guest, maybe a scrap of pork at Christmas. And spices, forget it. Those were for lords who could afford to sneeze pepper. Your veggies were tough, your all was gritty, and your cheese was a moldy gamble. If you had a cow, you're practically bourgeois. But one bad season, and you're back to boiling bark. Nobles, meanwhile, were living the medieval equivalent of a Michelin star life. Sort of. Their tables groaned with game like venison or boar, roasted to a crisp and drowned in sauces thick with saffron or cinnamon. They ate white bread, soft and fluffy, while you're gnawing on a loaf that could double as a warhammer. Their veggies were fresher, their fruit imported, and their wine came from Bordeaux, not a barrel of regret. They even had desserts, marzipan or candied fruit, while your sweetest treat was a dream about honey. But it wasn't just about quality, it was quantity and show. Noble feasts were flexes, with 20 courses of peacock swan, or pies that exploded with live birds for the woe factor. Servants scurried, minstrels played, and the lord's wealth was measured by how much food he could waste. Peasants might get invited to a lord's feast for harvest or holy days, but you're eating scraps off the floor while they're carving the good stuff upstairs. The middle ground, merchants or skilled artisans, ate better than peasants, but not noble level. They might score some mutton or a soft roll, maybe even a pinch of spice if business was good. But they're still worlds away from the Lord's gilded banquet. The church reinforced this divide, preaching humility while monks dined on fish from private ponds and sipped abbey brewed ale. Tithys stripped your grain, leaving you hungrier while they stockpiled. Even food laws were classist. Poaching a deer could cost a peasant his life, but nobles hunted for sport. Kitchens told the story, too. Peasants cooked over a smoky hearth with one crusty pot, while noble households had stone ovens, spits, and teams of cooks who still managed to burn everything. Presentation mattered for the rich. Think gold-plated dishes or food dyed with expensive saffron, while your bowl was a chipped wooden thing you shared with the dog. The irony. Nobody ate, well, by modern standards. Nobles got gout from overindulgence, while you're scurvy-ridden from malnutrition. But the gap was stark. Your food screamed survival. Theirs screamed supremacy. So, as you slurp your watery pottage, brace for the next chapter: medieval food and trade, where imports brought flavor, but only for those with coin. We'll explore why your plate stayed bland while the world got spicy. Keep your wallet. This is gonna cost. The medieval world was getting smaller, with trade routes bringing exotic flavors from far off lands. But unless you were swimming in gold, your plate stayed as bland as a monk's sermon. Let's sail into the spicy sea of medieval food and trade, where imports were a rich man's game. and peasants were stuck with the same old slop. Trade was booming by the late Middle Ages, with merchants hauling goods from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The Silk Road and sea routes brought spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, plus luxuries like sugar, citrus, and almonds. These weren't just ingredients, they were status symbols, costing more than your entire village. A sack of saffron could buy a warhorse, and a single nutmeg was worth a cow. Nobles sprinkled this stuff like medieval influencers, not for taste, but to flex their wealth. You, a peasant, are still seasoning your pottage with dirt and disappointment. Local trade was more your speed, but it was a slog. You'd barter turnips or eggs at the market, dodging shady vendors who'd sell you moldy grain or a fresh fish that's been dead since Charlemagne. Regional goods, like salted herring from the Baltic or wine from Bordeaux, might trickle down, but they were pricier than your annual rent. If you scored a sip of wine, it was probably so sore it could strip paint. International trade was a noble's playground. Italian city, states like Venice and Genoa were the Amazon of the day, shipping spices, dried fruit, and even rice to Europe's elite. The Crusades opened doors to Middle Eastern foods. Think dates or rosewater, but only lords could afford them. Hanseatic League traders brought cod and furs. But again, that's for the castle crowd. You're lucky if you see a dried fig at a festival, and even then, it's probably wormy. Trade wasn't just about food, it was power. Kings and popes controlled key routes, taxing merchants until their purses bled. Pirates and bandits didn't help, jacking up prices by raiding caravans. The church got its cut, too, demanding tithes on imports while preaching simplicity. Meanwhile, your global cuisine is a leek you stole from the neighbor's pig. Ports were chaos. Think muddy docks swarming with sailors, thieves, and rats bigger than your dog. Goods spoiled en route, so that, fresh, orange might be a moldy lump by the time it hit the market. Adulteration was rampant. Fake saffron or watered down wine was as common as fleas. Even the rich got scammed, but they could afford to shrug it off. For peasants, trade brought crumbs. A bumper harvest might let you barter for a pinch of salt, but most of your food was hyper-local. Grown, scavenged, or stolen from your own patch of dirt. The spice trade teased a world of flavor, but it was locked behind a paywall you'd never crack. So, as you chew your flavorless bread, brace for the next mess: medieval food and war, where conflict turned your diet into a battlefield. We'll dive into why sieges and raids made hunger your enemy. Keep your shield up. This is gonna get brutal. War in the Middle Ages didn't just wreck your village. It obliterated your already pathetic pantry, turning hunger into a weapon sharper than any sword. Let's charge into the battlefield of medieval food and war, where armies treated your crops like an all you can eat buffet and left you eating dirt. Imagine your hamlet, barely surviving on pottage and crusts, when some lord's petty grudge sends a swarm of armored looters your way. These guys didn't pack a picnic. They foraged, which meant raiding your grain, butchering your pig, and stomping your turnips into mush. Your cow. She's now jerky for Sir Greedy's squires, and your hidden sack of barley. Found and gone, probably to feed their war horses. If you tried to fight back, they'd torch your hut for giggles. Sieges were a special kind of hell. Trapped in a walled town, You're cut off from fields and markets. Your measly stores vanish fast. First the bread, then the moldy scraps. Then the rats you were cursing last week. Chronicles whisper of folks boiling shoes or gnawing tree bark, and in the darkest moments, some eyed their neighbors like walking roasts. Water was no better. Wells dried up or got spiked with dead cows by the enemy, making every sip a cholera lottery. Starvation broke you faster than catapults. Armies weren't chowing down on gourmet either. Soldiers lugged hardtack, a biscuit so tough it could double as armor, but it was gritty and weevil infested. Officers might snatch a looted goose or some pilfered owl, but the grunts slurped watery gruel or starved. Feeding thousands was a nightmare. Supply wagons got stuck in mud, raided by bandits, or spoiled under relentless rain. Your village was taxed to feed these goons, meaning you're handing over your last leak while they barbecue your chickens. Naval wars jacked up the misery. Blockades choked trade, so no salted fish from the Baltic or wine from France. Pirates swiped merchant ships, driving prices sky high. The rich could still bribe their way to smuggled saffron, but you're out here chewing grass, while they sip contraband claret. Even peace wasn't peaceful. Armies left fields trampled, mills burned, and livestock gone, so you're starting from zero with a spade and a prayer. The church, as usual, demanded tithes while you're starving, and nobles hoarded grain in their castles. Famine followed war like a bad hangover, and disease loved the party. Malnutrition made you a sitting duck for plague or fever. Kids and old folks dropped first, and surviving meant you're just the last one standing. So, as you scrape mud off your last carrot, brace for the grand finale. How this medieval food fiasco shaped the modern plate. We'll explore why your burger owes a debt to those grim days. Grab a snack. This is gonna tie it all together. We've slogged through the medieval food swamp. Gruel, rats, and all that tasted like regret. And now it's time to see how this culinary catastrophe birthed the glorious plates we scarf today. Let's wrap this saga with a look at how the Middle Ages food fails paved the way for your juicy burger and iced lat. First, let's give a sarcastic round of applause to famine and war for forcing folks to get creative. When crops tanked and armies swiped your last turnip, peasants learned to stretch scraps. Think pottage on steroids, mixing weeds, bones, and desperation. This waste not, want not vibe stuck, evolving into modern comfort foods like stews and casseroles, where you toss in whatever's in the fridge and call it dinner. Trade was the real game changer. Those spice-crazy nobles, dropping gold on pepper like it was crypto, opened routes that brought flavor to Europe. By the late Middle Ages, merchants were hauling sugar, citrus, and coffee, setting the stage for your morning espresso and tiramisu. The Crusades, for all their chaos, introduced Middle Eastern goodies like rice and almonds, which crept into recipes that eventually became your takeout staples. The rich's obsession with flexing at feasts, swans, gold-plated pies, pushed culinary showmanship. Medieval chefs, despite their knack for burning everything, laid the groundwork for fancy plating and molecular gastronomy, where your steak comes with a foam nobody understands. Even their weird sauces, drowning rancid meat in cloves, were baby steps toward modern flavor combos. Peasant grit deserves props, too. Your rock, hard bread and funky cheese were ancestors of artisanal sourdough and stinky brie. Fermentation, born from necessity when milk or ale went south, gave us yogurt, pickles, and craft IPAs. And those grim preservation tricks, salting, smoking, morphed into the charcuterie boards you pretend to pronounce correctly. The church's fasting rules, while a pain, forced folks to get cozy with fish, leading to classics like Fish and Chips or Ceviche. Exploration kicked it up a notch. Columbus and Paul's, chasing spice routes, stumbled on the Americas, bringing back potatoes, tomatoes, and corn. Imagine Italian food without tomato sauce. Medieval peasants did, and it was bleak. These new world crops revolutionized diets, making your fries and pizza possible. Hygiene's another win. Medieval markets, with their fly-swarmed meat and dodgy pies, screamed for regulation. Guilds and later governments cracked down, paving the way for health codes that keep your takeout from killing you. Even dental care, non-existent back then, owes its rise to the tooth-shattering bread that made folks beg for better. The class divide. Nobles with their saffron, peasants with their dirt, fueled a hunger for equality. Modern food culture, with its accessible flavors and global menace, is a middle finger to that elitism. Every time you grab a taco or sushi, you're living the dream medieval serfs couldn't. So, next time you bite into a burger, thank the Middle Ages for their misery. It taught us what not to do. From pottage to Pinterest recipes, we've come a long way, baby. Now, go eat something delicious, because you deserve it after this grim tour. Peace out and stay tasty. We've clawed our way through the medieval food pit. Slimy pottage, weevil, riddled bread, and all that tasted like a barnyard's bad day. And now it's time to seal this saga with a final, glorious bite. Let's tie a bow on this culinary car crash by zooming out to see how the Middle Ages kitchen nightmares forged the foodie paradise we scarf down today. Buckle up, because this is where the past hands you a pizza and a beer. Those grim days of chewing bark and dodging dysentery weren't for nothing. Medieval peasants, with their knack for surviving on crumbs and curses, taught us resilience. When famine hit, they turned acorns into flour and rats into stew. A hustle that lives on in our love for nose to tail cooking and quirky forage dishes. Ever tried a fiddlehead fern salad? That's your inner serf saying, thanks, starvation. The noble spice obsession, where they'd bankrupt a village for a pinch of saffron, wasn't just flexing. It rewired the world. Their greed for flavor kept trade routes humming, linking east to west and dumping cinnamon, sugar, and eventually chocolate into our laps. Without their spice fever, your pumpkin spice lat would just be sad milk. Speaking of trade, the merchants dodging pirates for a sack of pepper were the OGs of global cuisine. They set the stage for curry in London, tacos in Tokyo, and that fusion food truck you hit up last week. The church, for all its fasting nonsense, accidentally birthed culinary creativity. No meat during Lent. Fine. Here's a fish pie or a lentil mush that's oddly tasty. That's why your vegan buddy's quinoa bowl owes a nod to some monk's misery. The New World was the big plot twist. Medieval folks were choking on turnips when explorers tripped over potatoes, tomatoes, and avocados. These game changers turned bland European plates into the vibrant spreads we Instagram today. No medieval moldy cabbage could compete with a fresh guac taco. Even the hygiene horrors, flies on the meat, poop in the water, pushed progress. The market scams and tummy plagues forced rules that became modern food safety, so your burger doesn't come with a side of cholera. And let's not forget the class wars. The gap between a Lord's Swan feast and your dirt soup sparked a hunger for fairness. Today's cheap eats, from dollar slices to street cart shawarma, are a big middle finger to that elitism. Everyone gets a seat at the table now. So, as you munch your takeout, raise a fork to the Middle Ages. Their food was a dumpster fire, but it taught us to cook smarter, trade bolder, and savor every bite. From their rancid stews to your sushi roll, it's been a wild ride. Now, go raid your fridge, hug your microwave, and thank the universe you're not slurping pottage in a plague-ridden hut. This is Groke, signing off. Stay hungry, but, for good food. Catch you in the comments. Unless you're eating medieval gruel, then you're on your own.